We are live. We're locked
I think
in. You are locked on. We're
I
live.
may
This
have
is Misaligned.
to join in on my phone. There's a drag.
Yeah, that's fine. If you log off and log back in, that's all right. Right, to our viewers, we're live. You're locked in. You're locked on. Like I said, we are live. This is Misaligned. Welcome back to the podcast where we pull at the threads of power, culture, identity from the African perspective, wherever we are in the world, because we are a bit of a global representation of the African mindset and the African people. I'm your co-host alongside Yemi. Farouk is going to join us in a minute. Today, Jab's going to be a bit missing and he will be missed, but we carry on. And today's episode is going to be on goods and global trade. So today we're going to be checking and looking into the cracks in the global system, looking all the way from Trump's tariffs, the tariff wars fundamentally, right, to the military-led push for sovereignty in parts of Africa. What's really changing? Where does Africa really stand in all of this stuff? Does Africa even merit a spot in this conversation? Or are we talking about a slightly more globalized version of reality when it comes to these things? I'm going to hand over to Yemi to take us into the first segment. Yemi, a fantastic moderator. Let's get into it.
Right, thanks, Cross. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I think I've just kind of been struggling with my connection this evening, but we'll see how things go. But yeah, thanks, guys. Good to be back again. And it's all about geopolitics. And we are talking today about happenings in our world, what's happening over the kind of last few weeks, months, maybe years, if you like. And I think just to kick things off, it might be helpful for us to maybe just define the terms to begin with. And it's that word globalization, isn't it? And, you know, we've all heard it. The world's becoming a global village. What does this mean? What does globalization mean? I suspect that it'll mean different things to different people, like many things, you know, depending on what, you know, perspective you take and what part of the world you live in and whether or not the thing itself benefits you or not. But let's break it down. What is globalization? I suspect Farouk might be willing and happy to kind of give that a crack.
Oh, yes. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me, Cross and Yemi. Very important topic. Globalization, simply put, it's about global integration of commerce, of trade, of technology, of culture, and of influences. So on the face, it sounds nice and benign. And indeed, it does come with a lot of advantages and opportunities for people like us and people from our part of the world. It's about breaking down trade barriers, about access, and it's something that's kind of been evolved and been popularized over the last few decades by what's commonly called the global elite. And when people use this word, the global elite, we're talking about essentially mainly Western-based owners and controllers of capital and investors. So in a nutshell, that's what globalization means. So increasingly, during the decades that it took a hold, we saw trade barriers fall or being torn apart. We saw so-called free trade agreements being signed between different parties, and we saw further integration of the global south of Africa, of Asia into the global economy, into the global value chain, into the global logistics chain. And so that's what globalization means. It came with a lot of opportunities for Africa, vis-a-vis access to job opportunities, access to technologies, access to markets, among others. So in terms of the advantages, and since COVID, things like remote working opened up opportunities to IT experts say people can sit in Lagos and do. Cross is an IT person. You can sit in Lagos, sit in Akwa Ibom, sit in Abuja, and work for global tech companies in America and get paid in dollars. So on the positive side, Africa is a country with a lot of youth, a lot of talent, very educated people. So they could access this global marketplace from home. On the disadvantage side, it just meant that unlike countries like, say, China, Africa was integrated into the global economy. We couldn't build our own systems, our own companies. We couldn't build our own resilience and local production capacity, which then meant that we further lost economic and political sovereignty in return for these advantages. We'll talk more about that, but in terms of an introduction, that's kind of an overview of what globalization is, what the benefits are, and what some of the pitfalls might be. Thank you.
I haven't got a whole lot to throw into that. I mean, I imagine you've got your definition you're about to throw in a second, but I just wanted to just segue off Farouk's points there, and I agree with him 100% in terms of the general ideas and the general definitions. But there's two things I want to add. I'll just do a very baseline definition. For me, globalization basically is just that concept of an increase in interconnectivity and interdependence across the world. That's it for me. Now, there are multiple different layers in which that interconnectivity and the interdependence are not necessarily reflected, but showcase themselves in the world. First touched on a number of them. I'm just going to add two. And I think these two are probably going to be the fulcrum of the conversation we're having today. The first piece is around cultural globalization. In this context, we're talking about ideas and values and traditions being globalized, whether it's Western values, which is something we've seen quite a lot of, or it's Eastern values, because that's been happening a lot lately as well. Or it could even be African values that we've seen. I'm not even sure where Africa even sits if you think about it. Like EMEA, yes, but what is Africa? Is Africa like middle? Anyway, that's a different conversation about where Africa sits. But even African values moving on, when we look at the Afrobeat culture, for example, and how we're able to shape the culture around music. But it's all these things that matter in terms of culture. Looking at media, fashion, the kind of foods that we're dealing with, the languages that matter and are important in the world. Look at Brexit and how that's changed the importance of English language in the world. And I think the second thing is social globalization, and that's important to talk about as well. We're talking about migration and the movement of people across different areas, which is a very salient issue. And that's been determining quite a lot of things that have been happening in the world in the past, I would say since 2016, or the Brexit vote is probably one of the most pivotal examples of how social globalization has been understood by people as a thing. How social globalization is something we need to be aware of. We often talk about technological globalization, phones going across the world. We talk about economic globalization, different tools and assets and different goods and services, etc., going across the world. Technological globalization, making sure that we've got all this rapid, the communication moving across different places, alluding to what Farouk was talking about earlier as well, where he was explaining about my background. I'm in IT. If you don't know, well, hello, you know now. And that kind of field where I work, I can work globally across the world with multiple different people. My background has spanned quite a few different continents. Very often I'm working in 4 continents. This has been one of my previous roles has been working across 4 different continents using same technology, similar sorts of language in terms of querying that technology. And we've been able to globalize that to that degree. But I think those two things I wanted to just throw in there around cultural globalization, which is quite important to talk about in terms of values and tradition, but also social globalization, where we're talking about the migration of people, the movement of people between different areas, and cross-border education in terms of how we look at education across different areas. Whether we're talking about things like Islamic views, probably not going to go into that in detail in this episode, and how that's being integrated into educational system or Christian views, etc. But also just that general idea about how socialization occurs across different cultures. But yeah, Yemi, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Cross. Thanks for it. So it does appear that we kind of have a broad agreement over what globalization means in theory. Okay, I suppose it might just be best to then sort of get away from that and into a bit more nitty-gritty to see, areas that might be a little bit more interesting to talk about. So now we've got this concept that both Farouk and Cross has kind of really very well articulated, where it just almost means we're becoming more involved with each other in increasing ways and then in different ways. And there are differences in, as you mentioned, technological, social, cultural, and all that kind of domains. But what does this mean then? Are there, because I say this again, because you have to think about this, right? And often in the world, there are losers, there are winners. Okay, there are not very many situations where people go into and everyone wins, even though there are, and we can envision a perfect world to be that way. Okay, so we've had globalization for a while now, or at least increasing attempts at globalization. Are there any winners? Are there any losers? Who are they? Why so?
So I'm itching to give a go. As I said earlier, it appears to be. I don't want to go over the concept again. On paper, it's great. Trade is one of the foundations of prosperity, and that says you make your goods, your services, and you freely trade with others. And there have been clear winners as the world has become more integrated and more globalized. One of the biggest winners, which we talk about all the time, is China. It joined the World Trade Organization just over 2 decades ago or thereabout, opened up its markets to over 1 billion people who now are the manufacturers for the world. Started initially making fake products, sent tens of thousands, millions of its people abroad to learn in universities in the US and the UK and in the West. They've all gone back now, and China is now leading the tech race. So it started bottom of the food chain, producing fake products, China plates in Nigeria, we called it in the early 90s, and they've walked up that value chain. So China is a big leader, is a big winner from the integration of our more interconnectedness, falling of trade barriers. They are entering into the World Trade Organization and purposeful leadership. There are also other big winners, the Gulf Arab states, Dubai, Qatar, Saudi Arabia. We see reforms there. We see them attracting talent from all over the world, high pay. We see from the West, Western services going there to help them develop systems and institutions. And we see them growing in leaps and bounds. These are countries that, on the whole, were extractive like us, resource rich, but without systems and institutions. Again, stable, purposeful, smart political leadership, take advantage of the marketplace. Simple. You produce something, you sell, you trade, you become wealthy. The Singaporeans, the Chinese, the Gulf Arab states, and increasingly so, countries like Vietnam, Mexico, have latched onto this globalized marketplace and made the best of it for themselves and their people. So I will consider them the winners. Of course, top of the food chain is the global elite in the West. I call them the owners of cheap capital. They've integrated the rest of the world. So whereas these countries I've talked about have managed to extract meaningful gains for themselves and their people, but they are in the minority. The vast majority of the global South have lost out. And it's a combination of, we have to take personal responsibility of poor leadership, poor vision, in political instability on one hand, but also a combination of the very fact that weaker systems and younger nations are unable to compete with stronger ones. So what's happened to countries in Africa and most of the global South? We've essentially lost out. We've seen a second wave of japa and loss of labor, loss of young people, loss of fertile people who can work, who can procreate to the centers of success, the Middle East and the West. We see the destruction of local industries. So what does globalization mean? It means your market, as a market, 200 million Nigerians. We're a market, and people can come and sell things to us. Employers take things from us. They've got cheaper capital, they've got more management experience, they've got better technology. We can't compete, so our local industries fail. They become untenable. So in that way, they have been losers, mainly in Africa and also in many parts of the global south. Why? Poor political leadership and an unfair system. Thank you.
For clarity, Yemi, could you ask that question again, just so I make sure I'm on the same page?
So, can you hear me okay?
Can't see you, which is interesting because you're speaking, but your face is not moving.
Well, I can live
AI
with that.
generated image of Yemi.
So yeah, I suppose the question was with regards to the nitty-gritty of globalization. So I think both of you have kind of defined globalization in a way that is coherent and that essentially agrees with one another. So the question then was, right, we've got this thing called globalization where we're becoming more and more integrated. Like many things in life, you can end up with a scenario where less likely everyone wins, but more likely where there are winners and losers. So the question the question was about whether there are winners and losers here with globalization, and if that's the case, who are the winners and who are the losers? And an emphasis, particularly on the African perspective, would be, I think, would be welcome.
I think to answer this question, we need to go back a little bit around what globalization was in the beginning and how this even started. So the concept of globalization started with, we could go as far back as a Bretton Woods. I'm a bit careful with going back that far because it's a bit difficult to be able to really nail down a few of the details. But things like the WTO, NAFTA, China joining the WTO as well itself in 2001 or 2000, I think it was. I'm not sure when that was. It really changed how we're trading because these things allowed, there was a basic standardization across these different things. Now, I like PESTLE. So those of you who are now aware, there's something called PESTLE in economics. And it's a kind of analysis that's generally used for organizations to understand what's happening around you, right? So within PESTLE, the PESTLE is an acronym for political, economic, sociocultural, or sociological, social, depending on where you come from, technological, environmental, and legal. Now, these are the factors that always tend to affect how effective you are as an organization. But I tend to think that this applies to countries, and it also applies to regions, and it applies to political conglomerates as well, in terms of the kind of agreements that exist with things like NAFTA or NATO, etc. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that for now, unless anybody wants me to dive a little bit deeper. But then with all of these different groups coming in terms of the globalized view around how we deal with things, Africa came in, and all Africa has done so far has been to be a supplier of raw materials. We've just been producing all the goods and services that everybody else needs. We do the cobalt, we're going to do all the different kinds of raw materials, the gold, the diamond, etc. We've all heard about the diamond, they've even done movies about this diamond excavations in South Africa and different parts of Eastern Africa as well around this. And we're also consumers of finished goods. Think about petroleum. We have petroleum raw. We have that LNG in Nigeria. We have petroleum there. We extract it. Although this is changing now with the new refineries, that's a different conversation. But we have the raw materials. We export it and they send it back to us to use. Imagine us creating that raw material. We're extracting fuel, petrol in our own country, sending it to somebody else to process it and send it back to us for us to utilize that. So we're now at the point where the suppliers of raw materials and we're the consumer of finished goods without being involved in globalization itself. in terms of determining what's being used and how it's being used. I think
So
that's
that
been
seems like
sorry.
So,
yeah.
Ross,
Yeah,
this
go on.
what you've just described, I've used it before as an example of how, because of our position in the global value chain and the globalized system, as Africans, we end up with a net loss because the value added to a resource makes that resource several magnitudes more expensive than the resource itself.
Agreed.
So if we sell 2 million barrels of oil, crude oil as the resource, and we are buying tens of millions of petrol back to consume, at the end of that trade, we have a net loss.
Yes, agreed.
Because the finished product we're buying, which we become consumers, unfortunately, it's several magnitudes more expensive. We lose out on all of the other value-added products from the petroleum. And it's shocking that Africa has played itself into this space for complex reasons, chief of which would be leadership incompetence, um, imposed systems, corruption, and again, the system. When we talk about globalization, one point I want our audience to note is we talk about technological globalization. And whereas on one hand, the idea of globalization was to remove trade barriers and make trade more seamless. The flip side of it is that because the system itself wasn't designed by us, for us, there are a lot of barriers. They may all be framed as environmental rules. There may be credit checks. It may be the fact that we don't have availability to credit, or there are many reasons. Whereas we are open up, to be markets. We have barriers to access to sell our products. These barriers may be legal, such as European Union standards or UK standards or whatever. It could be credit rating agencies. It could be sanctions. There are just so many. I just wanted to speak on that.
I could throw something in there. I think some of this as well has to do with it's a previous topic that we've covered in the previous podcast, but it's one of the things that has to do with colonialism to a large degree. When we talk about globalization, we need to be very careful to understand who is globalizing versus the idea about globalization as a general concept. Because when we think about globalization, when we talk about it, very often we say globalization, it means that everybody is globalizing. No, that's not how that works. Globalization generally works with a very specific set of concepts that are able to move to that degree. That's why I wanted to break it down to those key things. If we break it down, it's easier to understand. It's the pestle concept of when we talk about globalization, we talk about political globalization. Well, what political views matter? What political views are acceptable and what views are not? The African views, we have very traditional views about how we see family, how we see economics to a large degree, how we see social interactions, how we even see class, even though it's a bit interesting when we think about that because that varies across the entire African continent. But that changes depending on how we're globalizing. At the moment, is different. You have to have a very specific kind of political system in place for you to fall into the globalization phenomena that's happening. Same thing with economics. You have to have a very specific kind of economic system, which is interesting, considering the fact that Trump and his own agenda, which is almost autarkic, where he's aiming to at the moment. Autarky being, for those who are not aware, autarky is an economic system where there is zero trade. It's like, I'm not trading with you. You trade with yourself. I don't care about you. I'm trading myself. I don't care. I'm going to build my own stuff. And now he's aiming for something like that. The sociocultural elements about that as well. What's acceptable socioculturally? What isn't? What kind of technology are you using? We're talking about the iPhone. We're talking about Android, Samsung, etc. Market beats as we're using these specific kinds of technology to interact. Facebook and TikTok, Twitter, YouTube that we're on right now, that we're using, these are all things that are part of globalization. Environmental factors, legislative. these things determine what globalization means. And in the vast majority of cases, this is determined by a very small proportion of key players across the world. I'm not going to go, I had a slight conversation with someone who may be watching, but we had a very quick conversation about this. And he was pointing out the fact that we don't actually know the real players. There's probably a very, very small, and we talked about this briefly when we we're talking about the instantiation of the Bretton Woods institution and how it's a very small proportion of the world that determine how the IMF, World Bank, etc., would come about to affect billions of people's lives. It's a very small number of people who are at that convention. But the conversation that we're having was very interesting to see that he was pointing at that well, even with all of this stuff, we see all the big names, we see all the big players. Really, what matters is a small number of people somewhere who determine what globalization means across these different characteristics and these different criteria. What do you think about that, Farouk?
I mean, I agree with you. You raise a very, very important point. And if I am to summarize, essentially what you're saying is that the globalization is also about power dynamics. It's about the powerful imposing a political, economic, cultural vision on the rest. It's the way the jungle works, it's the way geopolitics works, and it's the way the world works. That's what I'm hearing you say. And I'm in alignment as regards that. I'm in alignment as regards that. And in terms of economic philosophy, now, I mean, I may be moving to the next segment here. Yemi, we've lost Yemi temporarily. In terms of economic philosophy, I have been one, even before the Trump era, that have always advocated national sovereignty. Production made in Nigeria, by made in Nigeria, value chain in Nigeria, develop our comparative advantage. So Yemi, you're welcome.
Well, misaligned on this one, I like that. That's good.
Yeah, Yemi, you're welcome. So basically, I was just taking off from where Cross ended up, and I'm saying what I was hearing him say was globalization was about power dynamics and was and existing power structures, and it's essentially about those who are wealthy, strong, influential, imposing a political vision, an economic vision, and a technological vision on the rest of us, with their interest in mind.
Yep.
And I have said, in terms of political ideology, I would describe myself as a Pan-Africanist or a nationalist that believes that, but also a pragmatist that believe that as much and so that I believe we should find solutions that work for us regardless of ideology. There's a saying about Chairman Mao saying it does not matter whether it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as the cat catches the rat, it works for him. That's how I prefer we approach things. So there are many aspects where I would say,
how are you a nationalist?
So I would better describe myself as I'll better describe myself as a pragmatist, but more leaning to that part of it that says, look, we have to produce Nigeria, we have to buy Nigeria to the extent that it works. So I would say we should find a seat on the table where it's possible. So if you're going to come in and employ our young tech geniuses like Cross from Lagos, we retain them in Nigeria, by all means come in. We regulate that, we protect our own population from cultural imperialism or decay based on our own objectives. So allow that. Find a seat on the table. In things like production, we have the highest number of poor people on earth in Nigeria. We have 10 million children out of school. We need jobs for them. We need to produce. And so in sectors, low-hanging sectors like heavily subsidizing agriculture, primary industries like textile, agriculture, and production. Yeah, by all means, we what are we going to import? You talked about becoming consumers of products. What's sustaining that? So we extract, sell, and then use it to buy stuff, or do we invest in or industrializing our agriculture and employing tens of thousands and millions of Nigerians to work, and then walk up the value chain that way? So in sectors like that, I'm the one that I supported the additional Goodluck Jonathan, Buhari's Anchor Borrowers Fund, and the push to increase rice production in Nigeria, for example. I supported the limit on importation of rice, for example. I supported Obasanjo's backward integration policy that made the likes of Dangote become the largest producer of cement in Africa, for example. So in things like that, where we've got the resources in Nigeria, we can add value and create an industry in Nigeria to employ our people, to retain value, to retain jobs and livelihoods. In sectors like that, I'm a nationalist, even if it comes at a small cost, even come at the cost of things being a bit more expensive for a while to make those industries take up. Because how else are we going to employ our youths? How else are we going to give them lives and livelihood? How else are we going to reverse Japa if we do not create jobs in Nigeria? And how are we going to create jobs? We're not going to create jobs by making commercial planes or flying to the moon. We're not on the value chain at that level. We're going to create jobs by focusing on agriculture, on textile, on banking, mobile banking, on IT, where we have the people, on training health workers, and globalized world. Let's train lots and lots and lots. We retain as much as we can. Others go and they send back in remittances over 20 billion a year. So we get to sit at the table and we create our own table at the same time. That's kind of my approach, pragmatism.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I mean, welcome back. I think we lost you for a few seconds there. I was keen on just looking at the other part about who exactly is. I mean, you can see that on the ticker at the bottom. But who exactly is tearing up this rule book that we've had already? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about making these changes and then doing things differently. And then it's an interesting question. It's like we had a post-World War II world order, which I referred to already when we were talking about the Bretton Woods institutions and the general idea post-World War II about restitution and the general economic structure and order that existed around that now. Currently, though, the West is pulling back. We've got the global South. If you think about it, when you look at that hemispheric view, the global South is pulling back around how things should work. Trump has focused really about his tariffs, and he's done some fantastically incredible tariffs that he's established across the world, even across to the UK. The UK was forming, we have the special relationship. No, you don't. You also get your own tariff. And then we've got all these things about on the EVs. We've got what's happening in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, where they're getting rid of France and they're pushing that all out. ECOWAS is struggling at the moment as well. So it's one of those things where we start wondering and saying, well, who's scattering everything? And then why are they really scattering everything?
Well, I think what's happened is clear. China was invited to dinner when they let it into the World Trade Organization 2 decades ago. And the Chinese have beaten the West at their own game, using their own rules, by their own parameters. And I think Trump is not happy. He doesn't like the game anymore. So
can I just say something? Can I just say something very quickly about that?
Go on.
To tell the joke. It reminds me when we were children, what you've just described. So you know would go to the playground to play football, and often it'll be someone who brings their football for the rest of the group to play, and it would always tend to be that expectation that they had the stronger team and won the game. And I can remember certain occasions where things didn't go according to plan, and the owner of the ball...
They would take their football away.
So this is, in a sense, this is essentially
my football, not yours.
Yeah, that's essentially what Trump is doing. I mean, the Chinese came to your game and they beat you at it, and you are like, oh, it's not working for me anymore. Give me my football. That's why Trump is throwing tantrums, talking about deficits, and the rest. And I mean, the US remains the wealthiest nation on earth, the strongest nation on earth, and by a mile benefited the most from a globalized economy. For one, the dollar is the reserve currency. And because it's a reserve currency, the rest of the world is willing to exchange its goods and services and labor for the printed dollar, which essentially is the US saying, I owe you, and they can consume and consume and consume and consume, with all of the inherent benefits of having the reserve currency, including the transaction cost we all pay for using the dollar and accessing that system. But the Chinese have come on board, and as I've said, they've won at it, and they keep winning, and they will keep winning because using the framework Cross brought on the political, economic, technical, and cultural level, they are more efficient, develop more efficient systems, and they are now projecting soft power, hard power. They're building more ships, both commercial and military ships, than the rest of the world combined. They are the biggest trading partner to most of the world. They are posting trade surpluses, and the projections are that in a few years they would have eclipsed the US economy, even using just nominal GDP. By purchasing power parity already, they are already the biggest economy by a mile. So someone is not happy, someone is throwing tantrums, someone is not recognizing how interconnected and complex things are, and thinks tariffs will reverse it. I think it's irreversible. I think tariffs and a trade war will damage everyone. It will be a race. It will be a race to the bottom, and the question then will be, who will endure the pain better, and who will come out of it better? Not who will lose. I think everyone will lose, because we're already very, very interconnected.
Does this mean that globalization or the global order is breaking down then, Cross?
I don't see any evidence for it, because if we look through that paradigm as well, all that's happened is that there's a shift in terms of who has the authority across those different criteria. So China has come and they've done a Chinese thing where they've taken over responsibility and authority over all of these different areas, and they run it. From a sociocultural perspective, they've used TikTok to completely infiltrate the world. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. I look at TikTok and I see quite a few videos, and I'm wondering, how are these people actually posting their lives? And not even just posting them, they're destroying their lives based off of the posts that they're posting there. But they feel that that's a reasonable thing for them to do. That concerns me greatly. And then we look at the other elements of that, the technological perspective. China, with the IP protocols that they require, is a very specific amount of IP that they need you to hold within the country based on company ownership, etc. The political power that they wield with their allegiance and their relationships with non-Western organizations, economic power, they hold it. They are China. I don't need to explain that one. It's straightforward. Do you know what I mean? Socioculturally, I think some of the things like mukbangs and some of these things are artificially engineered by the Chinese. That's my perspective about this one. I don't know if there's any evidence to prove that this is true or not. I don't know. But I think that some of these things, sociocultural behaviors, are being primed, being controlled through Chinese tools and Chinese systems that they've created. The algorithms that exist within general social media mediums seem to me to be artificially generated through things that generally benefit China. Legislatively, what's happening? They were trying to ban China, ban TikTok, which is China, really. What happened? They couldn't do it. They've been postponing it in America for the past, they've postponed it twice now, I think, if I recall correctly. They've not been able to ban them. Why?
So
Because
do you
they
think
have
the West? So
go
do you
on.
think the West doesn't adopt the same strategies about trying to use sort of conditioning and education and social media
I think it doesn't
influence?
matter. I think what matters is who is effective at doing it. So you could try to adopt whatever you want to adopt. You have two people who are fighting or doing boxing, right? And somebody is very good at jabs. It's like, well, I'm adopting the jabs. I'm very good at jabbing. Well, somebody else just gives you.
And someone else is very good at cross.
Yeah, he's doing.
They're both boxing moves, jab and cross.
It doesn't matter who's able to win the fight. Based on who's going to win the fight. Who's going to win you based off of might and technique. And it doesn't matter if the technique is the same technique as yours. What matters is that their technique and their power is able to overpower yours, and then they win. And that's where we are. That's the reality of the situation in which we exist.
Me ask the question: has globalization ended? One way I want to reflect on that question is, if we think we are at an inflection point where China is in the process of toppling the world order and becoming the biggest economy, say in the next half century or century, the question I want to ask myself is that, will a global economic Chinese hegemony want to pull apart freer trade? I think the answer is no. And that's one. So two, the owners and controllers of global capital, the vanguards, the BlackRocks, who own and invest trillions of dollars of money in all companies, and I mean all, Chinese, Japanese, American, do they want to lose this market? Again, the answer is no. So the two biggest players, so the current MAGA, a section of the MAGA Trump political ideology is tariffs. Let's protect our market. We are the biggest consumers. We buy the most from the world. Let's rebalance our trade. That's their instinct. But against the rest of the world, the European global elites, the wealthy Gulf states who have set up sovereign wealth funds and now sit on the board of BlackRock and Vanguard, the Chinese who manufacture, who have invested the most amount of resources in human history, developing infrastructure via land, sea, and rail around the world, building ports, building airports around the world to be able to trade and sell. They have invested and they are vested in freer trade. They are invested and they are vested in globalization. So I've talked about three powerful blocks now: the Chinese, and their investment in the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the largest investment in infrastructure in human history. I've talked about the owners of capital out of the US. I've talked about the rich Gulf states with wealthy sovereign wealth funds, the European elites who see trade as wealth. Be it that they all want to model it in their own image. These are vested interests in a globalized world, in access to markets and people, in making us in Nigeria, making the 1 billion people in Africa, they're consumers. So, is this the end of globalization? I don't think so. I think Trump is going to fail in trying to put tariffs and trying to become protectionist, just because the immense pressure he will be put under, either by the bond markets, the capital markets, or lobbyists. Already he's giving waivers for iPhones, for semiconductors. So he's going to fail. Even if he gets his third or fourth term, he's going to go away and he's going to go back to business as usual. And so I don't think this is the end for globalization. I think the future is more trade. I think the future is more integration. And I think Trump and MAGA is just a blip. And even Trump himself will have many more climb downs and will adjust to the reality and the direction of things.
Okay.
I mean,
so I don't think this is the end of globalization. And so, therefore, looking forward, I think the likes of African leaders should be thinking strategically long term and building alliances, integrating with BRICS, talking to the Europeans, talking to the rich Gulf states, inviting technological transfer, cultural transfer, loans, infrastructure investment, and encouraging young Africans to acquire skills, to engage with the global economy, to produce and to sell. That's the path forward.
Okay.
Thanks. I think we've just got a comment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So we've got a comment from Udo Chisholm. Can Africa still industrialize under today's strict environmental standards when Europe industrialized freely in the 1800s, polluting itself to prosperity? Our climate accords new forms of control. I think we've kind of touched on this very briefly, but I think it'd be helpful for us to get it in a bit more detail before we move to the next and last section. But I suppose what Udo Chisholm saying in a sort of wider context is that you've got the world leader, certainly at the time and up till now, developing with rules that they set for themselves. And once they've navigated something and no longer need those rules, they change it to accommodate new goals, climate, human rights, or whatever it is, which are often good, but then mean that those coming behind them really can't compete.
Yeah.
Is this something you can speak to, Cross?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is something closely tied into what I was talking about in terms of globalization and who actually determines what globalization is. I think globalization is tying into a previous conversation we had on the previous episode. Again, if you saw some of the conversations we had earlier, please go look at the previous podcasts. But one of the conversations we had was around this and around how, at the end of the day, colonization is not necessarily always violent. This is colonization. That's what that is. We tell you how you need to deal with your environment. We tell you how you need to produce for us to accept you. Excuse me. We've got all these concepts about zero, what's it called? Zero climate, zero. I can't remember.
Net zero.
Net zero, and that's fine in Europe, but you're going to Africa and saying net zero, well, there's no lights. Very often in some places, I'm using no lights as a euphemism that we understand in Africa. And it's like, well, you cannot have that expectation of net zero. The same net zero concept that applies in the West should apply in Africa. And that's being utilized. So in my view, I think this is one of those things where these accords are a concept of control. Although I agree with you 110%, I think this is one of those systems that are utilized to be able to restrict others from becoming those globalization agents. If you look at what's happening, like I said, if you look at the criteria that I set out, all of those globalization agents require you to be at the top. This is restricting you to be at the bottom. It restricts us to be at the bottom as Africans.
So this is like me. This is like me as an adult on the football field, trying to make the 10-year-old who's learning how to play abide by rules that I have made for myself. Haven't learned as a 10-year-old freely without restrictions.
Correct. Up to the point where I'm now a 17-year-old or 25-year-old or whatever. And I'm now applying these rules to myself. And I'm not saying even these rules I'm applying to myself right now, I'm applying them to you as a 7-year-old, which is incredibly insane.
Okay. So
without rehearsing all you've said, I think the solution to this is to do a China. I'm sorry to say, cheat, ignore the rules.
Okay. So
that's that. I mean, ignore the rules.
Bear with me 1 second. So that leads us into the third segment, which you just kind of preempted it basically. So on the question, as we've got it kind of framed, is play the game or flip the board. There you go, Farouk.
Flip the board. Appear to be playing the game. Strategic pragmatism is what I call it.
Can we
strategic
do that?
Ambivalence is what I call it.
Do you think it's possible?
I would not tie my people's destiny and my national interest to any ideology or to any beliefs. So strategic ambivalence, strategic engagement. So what works for you? We've got coal in Enugu. We've got coal in Kogi State. We do not have it. We cannot generate enough power. We cannot refine petrol. Get our universities to build boilers and power this coal and power the economy. Without power, we cannot industrialize. And we cannot be discussing green energy with Europe when we have energy under our feet that humans used 200, 300 years ago to power steam engines, and that China is still using today. It's the biggest consumer of coal. India is increasingly using it. And recently, in the last few days, Trump just said the US should start using it. We cannot fight and develop with our hands tied. We must act in our national interests. I mean, we should be a responsible people and a responsible country. And as much as we can commit to current international standards in good faith, we should. But we must not be naive.
Cross.
So flip the board.
I mean, I don't actually have anything to add.
Which is extraordinary, right? So
I usually have a point.
right.
Like,
okay. So let's break this down now, because I think Farouk, you've kind of laid the foundations of what we must do, which Cross appears to agree with, and which I can't disagree with either. So, but from a practical point of view, so you are the president of Nigeria or Ghana or Mozambique. Where do we start? What do you begin? How do you begin to execute this strategic ambivalence in your favor? What are the first steps?
There is we discussed this before. We must come together and identify areas of mutual interest. And we are a market. We're 1.34 billion people. We are the youngest population group on planet Earth. We are smart. We can learn skill sets. So low-hanging fruits, education, building, tearing down trade barriers amongst ourselves. Okay? And this can happen at a political level with just realization. You don't need loans, you don't need technology to tear down trade and travel barriers so that goods and services can move freely. So that would be the first step. And at subcontinental level, say Nigeria, I mean, it all boils down to leadership here. The solutions have been iterated 1,000 times. The key thing is unity. Come together as one. India has doubled its GDP in the last 10 years. Doubled. In that same period, the GDP of Africa has stayed the same, while our population has grown. So that's actually degrowth. What does India have that we don't have? One political system. It's one country, 1.4 billion people. Africa is 54 countries, one similar population. So central planning, dedicated leadership, a single market. I mean, again, India is a country. I mean, China has bolted off. India is following. They could double their GDP in the next decade as well, and there will be a world power by then. With the Russia-Ukraine war and Western sanctions on Russia, what did the Indian Foreign Minister say? My priority is to keep powering the Indian economy. I'm going to buy gas and petrol from a place that suits my people. Prioritizing the Indian people. And they made that sovereign decision and continue to buy discounted Russian gas and oil, which then goes into their industries, and then they produce and they continue to grow. I mean, clearly they are nuclear armed. Clearly they are more powerful. They have more influence. Clearly they are less likely to be bullied. And that's high stakes geopolitics. We don't even need to go there. And nobody's going to come and bomb us if we decide to use coal. Nobody's going to bomb us if you say, okay, don't sell us cheap Chinese and Thailand rice. We're going to farm it. So we've got sparks here and there. I mentioned Obasanjo's backward integration policy for cement the other day. We paid a huge cost by paying more for cement, but we've got a fully indigenized and integrated cement industry in Nigeria now, to the extent that we're now exporting to the rest of Africa. Nigeria became the top 10, one of the top 10 producers of rice, thanks to additional Goodluck Jonathan Buhari's Anchor Borrowers Fund, where we produce Nigeria. That got us through COVID with limited implications. We didn't go begging like Egypt and Ghana because of the Ukraine war, because we produce. So it's about national interest, coming together, forming together to build a big market and negotiating with the rest of the world. And that's where we start. Ultimately, we need to arm ourselves. Ultimately, we need to educate ourselves when we want to play high stakes game, but we are nowhere near there now. We need to deal with the basics.
So thanks, Berger. Are there any opportunities, particularly saying, how Trump's tearing everything up now and just kind of putting globalization back on the sort of front burner to an extent that it probably hasn't been in a while? What do you see, Cross? Is this an opportunity for Africa, or is this just a storm that blows over and we're back to where we were?
I think this is one of the things, again, that goes back to the key criteria that determines whether or not we can globalize or not. And does this change any of the key criteria, the key factors? Politically, does it change anything for us? No. Economically, does it change anything for us? Yes. How so? Negatively. Does it change anything for us socioculturally? Yes. How so? Negatively. Technologically, does it change anything for us? Yes. How so? Positively. Because now we can focus on the Chinese aspect of things. Environmentally, does this change anything for us? Yes. How so? Well, actually, does it? Probably not. Let's just say that's neutral. Legislatively, does it change anything for us? Yes. How so? Again, depending on how we decide to choose that. If we choose to pick the side of China or the East, then we might be able to create some kind of positive outcome for ourselves in Africa. But the reality about this situation is that we're not the big players. That's just the truth. The truth is that using the pestle framework, politically, economically, socioculturally, technologically, environmentally, legislatively, we don't determine what happens in any of these areas across all the African countries and all the African powers. Even with the more recent things that have happened in terms of the African countries that have tried to take back control and take back power through their own kinds of means and their own mediums. I'm not putting my own views or opinions about what's happening there. But the reality is, everything that happens, we're consumers of, which is just ironic because we're going back to the first thing that we had in the first part of this conversation about how we're the suppliers of raw material, but we're also at the same time the consumers of the things that we create and we produce. And the reality is, in Africa, we consume. We consume what others tell us to consume. We consume whether or not it's whether or not it's China or it's America or it's Europe that's running the town, running the situation, determining what the political climate is, determining what the economic system is, determining what the sociocultural views and opinions should be at this point in time, determine what the technological slant is, determine what we should be doing with our environment, determining what we should be doing legislatively across our different areas in government. And we've seen all of these things being tested and tried across the years. We are observers and we accept them. What we need to focus on is who the best ones are while we bide our time. Hopefully, we'll become another China, because China did exactly that. They sat down for a long time, which the human capital policy that they did for a bit and the focus on intellectual property, they spent 30 years sitting down at the back of the pestle policy or the pestle concept. And then once they were in position to create their own powerful dynamic, what did? They they did that and they changed it. We're not in that position yet. So we should sit back and wait our turn. That's my view.
Thanks, Ross. Very, very well put. I've argued for a while, and some of it ties into what you've just said. I've argued for a while that I despair, and I despair, no, not in a conclusive way, but in a significant way, and that's partly because of this consumption issue you talk about. And I'm not talking about levels of consumption, right? I'm talking about what we consume, and I really see a problem where even sort of middle class African intellectuals measure progress by almost how Western our populations can be. You know,
Yep.
how many sort of flashy cars and iPhones and I argue that in a way this is a recipe to never catch up, because before you get comfortable with iPhone 12 as a population, there's 13 and then there's 14. This is a rabbit hole, right? And so at some point we've got to stop this, and we've got to stop it. And I suspect in a way that the Chinese did, which is that for you to be able to almost conquer this wave of globalization, you almost first have to shield yourself from it whilst engaging with it. It's almost a paradoxical thing that you have to do, right? You have to shield your population from the almost toxic intellectual.
Strategic engagement. Yeah, that's the word. Strategic engagement.
It's autarky. It's autarkic. It's an autarkic approach to the pestle agreement. You look at that and say, socioculturally, we're alone. Don't bring your sociocultural views in here. Your economic views, leave me alone. Your political views, leave me alone. Your technology, leave me alone. You see that in China, the internet is controlled and is completely controlled by the government. You know, your environmental views, leave me alone. Your legislation, leave me alone. You create your autarkic system, and that allows you to do exactly what you're saying there, Yemi.
And I think for us to really have sort of exponential growth, something like that. It doesn't have to. Again, you know, there might be different iterations of this, but something like that has to come in, because you want to start from a baseline where we measure. Well, certainly the majority of us measure well-being and prosperity from, you know, wearing a Kampala and, you know, being able to visit your neighbors.
Or increasing tons of maize and rice produced, increasing tons of value-added corn oil produced and exported. I mean, something more meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely, and it seems to me that has to be the starting point. Eventually, you would hope that we can cover some ground and then begin to kind of be a bit more relaxed. But as a starting point, and this is what we do. I mean, we all know this, don't we? This is what we do with children, isn't it? So when someone's a child, you almost start them out with relatively strict rules and routines, right? There's bedtime. There's this, we don't watch that, we don't go here. But you're not going to do this forever. You're doing it up to a point where increasingly they become more and more independent. They understand the spirit of the laws, put it that way, and they can roll with it, right? But it seems to me as a population that we've never really had that. And I put it to you guys, disagree with me if you misalign with me if you that even Europe has been through that phase where it wasn't anything goes, right? There were, do you know what I mean? There were sort of values homegrown and thought before we went into this globalization. It seems we've just jumped straight into it, and it just seems to me that there's a reckoning that needs to come from having these conversations and becoming increasingly louder about it. And I think it ties into what we discussed, was it last week or the week before, about the African identity. And I think it's all about identity. So having a strong sense of this is who we are. And, you know, it may be the case that in Miami, you know, the whole, you know, measuring of quality of life is about, you know, how many Rolls Royce you've got, and then that's fine, right? But that's Miami, right? You know, this kind of thinking cannot be allowed in, you know, the villages of Ondo State, where where university students then become tempted to begin to go online and do you see what I mean? And do unscrupulous things. And if you talk to some of these people, which are, you know, the level of ambition for what they are sort of, for where they're sort of at, it's corruption. You know, it's corruption of the minds at the highest level. And that cannot be good for us.
It depends again on power, and it depends on political control. Who is determining what is acceptable? So we've had multiple different empires through the history of time. Ottoman Empire, Genghis Khan did his own thing for a while. We've had multiple Roman Empire, generally speaking. Everyone talks about that. But these empires have the key thing about them is that they've always been able to determine what is acceptable and what isn't. So your view right now is that you're focusing on what's acceptable based on the current cultural climate within that specific area. And the truth is, I feel a little bit terrible saying this, but it doesn't matter what we feel about any of those cultural norms or our beliefs. What matters at the end of the day is who is the most dominant, who are the predominant characters in terms of the culture. They set what happens. From going back to pest, I'm going to chop out the EL because it's not relevant. From a political perspective, economic perspective, sociocultural perspective, and technological. That's all that matters. Those people, those individuals determine what happens to society. The rest of us just do what we do, but we have to fall in line, and that's just what it is, in my opinion.
So I want to go back to Cross. I like your framework very well. It's really helpful to think about this. I want to go back to how you linked it to the future for Africa, and I want to misalign slightly. Trump tariffs, Trump's protectionism, and all that we're discussing today is in the landscape of an evolving multipolarity. He is reacting to the environment that has been largely shaped by China's success, India's emergence, and Russia's military belligerence. That has shaped the world, BRICS as well. So we're talking about Trump's reaction and tariffs and increasing protection and challenge to globalization within that wider geopolitical context. And there are opportunities for Africa on a political level. There is an emerging multipolarity. The Chinese are willing to give us capital, protection to be their friends. They are cutting the world. Recently, they had a trilateral meeting with Japan and North Korea and South Korea. These are countries that are in the West political sphere. They've been talking to Australia to come, let's do a deal. They've been talking to Europe to come, let's do a deal. They're reaching out to Africa, even as Trump tries to tear down this system. Even as Trump says, give me my football, I'm leaving the field. China is trying to integrate people. So on a political level, we have opportunities to do more deals. In the 2 years Tinubu has been in power, he's been to Saudi, he's been to UAE, he's been to France, he's been to Europe, he's been to China. He's looking for capital, he's looking for political support, he's looking for technological input, he's looking for investments. So the emerging, so not bearing in mind now that the tariffs and the threat to globalization is a reaction to an emerging multipolarity. I think that wider landscapes gives Africa and Africans opportunities, political collaboration, economic collaboration, technical collaboration, various suitors or markets to talk to. So take one example with the tariff war now. America's biggest export, or one of its biggest export to China, is soya beans and maize. Guess who produces that at scale on the continent? South Africa.
Well, yeah.
So the Chinese will be having chats to them now. We're putting a 125% tariff on American farmers. Send your maize, send your soya beans to our 1.2 billion people. So that's an alternative market. That's a market that America loses that potentially we could gain. So I'm talking about opportunities now. Whether we realize that or not is a different matter. We have drones and helicopters
we've got
and
problems with that,
and
though. We've got problems with that, and this is why America is able to confidently do what they're doing. This is the issue. So with Africa, the controls are significantly, and we can both agree on this, I'm sure, lower than the controls that they have in America. In terms of what you're able to get, in terms of the quality of what you're able to get, the quality controls are going to be less, generally speaking, in South Africa than they would be in America. Now, maybe they're very specific, areas, specific organizations are able to deliver higher quality things. But if you're dealing with mass production, especially considering the number of suppliers and producers in America versus in South Africa or Nigeria or wherever you want to pick up that thing from, this is what America is dealing with. They're coming with the concept of we have the highest mass production of high quality goods at a different quality level, and we're saying we're applying these tariffs. If they drop those tariffs through a shared agreement with these countries, it changes the dynamic. So they don't even care about the short-term thing. This is my issue as well with the African concept, is that we'll focus on the short-term delivery. Okay, we can shoehorn ourselves in there because America is just behaving in a very Trumpian manner. How does that affect us long-term? It doesn't, because America can just focus on those key things, roll back on the trade tariffs, etc., and then create or recreate it, especially if they're able to get and prove that some of the things that they're getting are subpar quality. It's problematic, and it's just something to think about.
I mean, it is. There's no doubt about that. But I'm speaking to opportunities that policymakers need to engage with. Again, for the opening time, I'll mention the Anchor Borrowers Fund and the attempts to produce rice. It did get Nigeria into the top 10 rice producers ahead of the USA, behind the giants like China and Thailand and India. What was that? Financial instrument, regulation, technical support, farmers, mills, and then we ramped it up. If Nigeria doesn't take that opportunity, I mean, we've not mechanized our agriculture. We cannot compete with whatever North America does. So there's a lot of work to do there. But countries like Brazil that have mechanized their agriculture can step into that. Countries like South Africa can step into it. But there are opportunities, there are risks. But I don't want us or the audience leaving thinking that because a multipolar world is evolving, because tariffs are coming, things will be worse. I think with change, there are always opportunities and there will be risks. And I think it's about policymakers thinking deeply and looking at where new markets, new customers, new investors, new technologies are coming and how we can tap into that.
Yep. Agreed.
It's been fascinating, hasn't it? And in some ways, there's been lots of alignment rather than misalignment today. It seems a very topical area, and I'm sure over the next few weeks we're going to possibly have more to say about this. But final thoughts, shall we say? What's going on? Let's put it that way. And what do we need to do? Just some sort of maybe beginning to think about our final thought. What's Africa's place in globalization? How do we stem the tide of being at the bottom of the pile? You know, I think we've touched on some of this, but it'd be helpful if you can put your thoughts into a summary for us to kind of close.
I can summarize my thoughts pretty quickly. So we started off talking about what's going on in terms of globalization. What is globalization? And who's changing things across that space and what Africa can do. I think for me, fundamentally, globalization remains about power and control. It comes back to it, and it comes back to those key tenets, the 5, 6, but I think it's really 4. I mean, I'm jumping around the whole place, but it doesn't matter. You all know what I mean. If you watch this, you know what I was talking about. But it's really the 4 key things: who controls the political system, who decides what's happening economically, socioculturally, what's going on, and technologically, what the challenges are. I think, in my view, I think I'm going to just take a bit of a segue off the topics that we're talking about today, but to talk about something that's quite pertinent, is that Trump has done something that he considers to be pertinent, considers to be important and relevant. I don't necessarily agree that what he's doing is right, but we're in a position where people like that and countries like that are able to make global changes and massive shifts in terms of everyone else's economic, political, and legislative situations, where countries are forced to make changes to the policies and how they interact with international governments. Even the media is reacting differently based off of what Trump has done. But the reason why that matters is because globalization is really about the key people who are in power and who determine what globalization is. Globalization is not a random concept. It doesn't depend on everyone across the world growing into other places. Globalization is a few key players, a few key countries determining what happens globally. It doesn't mean that we're all growing globally and we're all sharing those cultural views or these sociocultural norms, or we're all accepting each other. No, it's about a few key players determining what's acceptable across the world. And that's what we're seeing playing out. From an African perspective, what can we do? We can go down the China route. We should focus on the key things that matter, deliver on value. China found a way that it could deliver on value, division of labor, and specialization. It really focused on that as a country. It focused on the human capital development concept that it really focused on. We need to identify what it is that we're good on. If we're focusing on raw materials, we focus on raw materials. If we're focused on human capital development, we focus on HCD. If we're focusing on specialization and division of labor, we focus on that. But we need to find out what works for us in a way that gives us positioning across these four key areas: political power, which we don't have; economic power, which we probably have, and we can probably focus on; sociocultural power, which we have some leg in, using music and general view about Afrobeat, Afrocentric concepts and ideals; and technology, which we've been building in a few different hubs, which we can talk about, but we can talk about this in a different episode. That's my final thoughts.
Farouk.
At times of stability, at times of change, at times of uncertainty, key things are leadership, leadership, leadership. Make no mistake, we are living in very interesting times. Things as we know it are changing rapidly. The direction of things are uncertain. What's in it for Africa? We need level-headed leaders at all levels. Long-term planning, engaging with opportunities, understanding the risks. So leadership, leadership, leadership. There are threats, there are opportunities, there are risks. Calm head, long-term planning. That's all from me.
Thank you so very much, guys. I think it's been a fascinating discussion tonight. Just sort of against the background of interesting times that we live in, and I'm sure that there will be more to talk about this in the episodes to come. I apologize very deeply for my disappointing internet connection tonight. I have to say it's very unusual. Very unusual.
Have you had tariffs imposed on your provider?
That is something that we
changes.
Yes, that's something that I have to look into, but that's not out of the realms of possibility, seeing what's been happening over the last few weeks. But thanks everyone for joining us. In the absence of any sort of last extra words, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. We are, I believe, kind of preparing a cracking topic again for next week. We'll get it across shortly. Join us again.
Thank you.
Signing out.
Signing out.